The biting, crisp autumn winds of late November 1995 swept silently across the rolling, frost-dusted hills of Oak Ridge County, carrying a sudden Arctic air mass down into the low-lying valley of Sunny Creek. The sky above the valley, usually a warm hazel gold at twilight, had hardened into a sharp, pale violet, hinting at an unprecedented cold front pushing down from the Canadian border weeks ahead of schedule. Beneath the deep green, glossy foliage of a 40-acre citrus grove, Loretta Vance stood quietly between two long rows of heavy, ripening orange trees. At 58 years old, Loretta was a woman whose hands bore the rough, calloused proof of endless seasons spent tending the land. Since the sudden passing of her husband 5 years prior, she had managed the 40-acre farm entirely on her own, balancing the delicate demands of the soil, the changing weather patterns, and the heavy physical labor required to keep the orchard thriving. Her citrus grove, planted by her father-in-law in the late 1950s, was an unusual sight in this part of the county, requiring meticulous care, microclimate management, and constant vigilance against the unpredictable Midwestern climate. This season had promised to be one of the most bountiful harvests in the farm's history. Hanging thick beneath the leafy broadleaf canopy were thousands of swelling, vibrant golden oranges, their skins tight, aromatic, and heavy with natural sugars, just 3 weeks away from peak commercial picking. However, as Loretta walked the length of the central lane, her heavy leatherwork boots crunching softly on the dry grass, she felt a sharp, penetrating chill rising from the damp ground, a telltale sign that an atmospheric temperature inversion was settling rapidly over the valley. Weather reports broadcast over the local farm radio earlier that afternoon had issued a severe freeze warning, predicting ground temperatures to plunge well below 24 degrees Fahrenheit before midnight. For a citrus grower, a sudden freeze of this magnitude before harvest is a total economic catastrophe. When temperatures drop below the critical threshold for several consecutive hours, the liquid juice vesicles inside the citrus pulp freeze and expand rapidly. This internal ice expansion ruptures the delicate cellular walls of the fruit, causing the essential oils and juices to leak out internally. When the sun rises and the fruit thaws, the once plump oranges collapse into dry, pithy, tasteless mush, rendering the entire year's crop unmarketable and worthless within a matter of hours. As the pale winter sun dipped behind the western ridge, the quiet stillness of the grove was shattered by the heavy rumble of a commercial diesel truck pulling up near the wooden equipment barn. Out stepped 2 regional sales representatives from a major agricultural machinery dealership, accompanied by an aggressive equipment contractor from the neighboring township. The men wore heavy insulated parkas with corporate logos and carried glowing digital temperature monitors and thick printed brochures. They walked briskly over to Loretta, pointing back at the flatbed trailer behind their truck, which carried several massive, industrial-grade propane wind machines and towed heavy diesel-powered mobile hot air blowers. The senior representative insisted that the impending Arctic freeze was far too severe for a lone widow working 40 acres with traditional hand tools. He warned her that broadleaf evergreen trees like oranges possessed no natural winter dormancy defense against a sudden hard freeze, asserting that without renting their high-powered mechanical warm air circulators and broad-spectrum propane heaters, her entire orchard would be completely wiped out before dawn. He rattled off alarming figures, claiming that neighboring commercial operations had already signed emergency lease contracts for thousands of dollars to deploy mechanized wind towers across their property. He pressed Loretta to sign an immediate emergency lease, warning that relying on outdated manual methods or basic farm instinct would guarantee total financial ruin for her family farm. Loretta looked calmly at the salesman, then turned her gaze back toward the quiet canopy of her orchard, touching the cool, smooth skin of a golden orange hanging near her shoulder. She listened to the heavy, thrumming idle of their diesel engines and evaluated their mechanical pitch against her decades of practical field experience and her deep understanding of fundamental physical laws. She knew that industrial wind machines, while effective under very specific atmospheric conditions, were notoriously unreliable during deep radiative freezes accompanied by high-velocity upper air currents. If deployed improperly during a sharp ground inversion, high-powered fan blades could actually pull even colder air down from the upper atmosphere, circulating a freezing downdraft directly into the sensitive lower branches of the trees. Furthermore, burning thousands of gallons of expensive fossil fuels in open diesel blowers generated intense, direct heat spikes that scorched the lower leaves and tender fruit clusters, creating thermal shock while draining her modest financial reserves with exorbitant fuel bills. Loretta politely declined their expensive emergency leases, shaking her head as the salesman warned her that her stubbornness would cost her everything. After the machinery truck rumbled away empty, the silence returned to Sunny Creek, colder and more intense than before. Loretta pulled her heavy canvas barn jacket tight around her shoulders, tightened her leatherwork gloves, and set to work implementing a time-tested, multi-layered passive freeze protection strategy rooted in fundamental thermodynamic principles and historic orchard care. Loretta hitched her vintage utility tractor to a flatbed wagon loaded with dense bales of damp hardwood sawdust, dried orange pomace saved from previous pressings, and aged orchardwood prunings. Operating with calm, deliberate efficiency, she distributed uniform mounds of the damp organic mixture along the windward perimeter and strategic interior corridors of the 40-acre grove. As the final traces of twilight faded into pitch-black darkness and the porch thermometer dropped toward the freezing mark, Loretta walked the rows with a small kerosene torch, carefully lighting the windward edges of the damp piles. Instead of bursting into bright, open flames that would waste thermal energy upward into the sky, the damp organic mixture began to smolder, slowly generating a dense, low-lying blanket of heavy white smoke. Guided by the gentle, creeping ground draft, the thick smoke drifted slowly between the tree trunks, rising gently until it pooled beneath the dense upper leaf canopy, creating an insulating cloud roof over the entire 40 acres. This dense smudge blanket served a critical scientific purpose. During a clear, windless night freeze, the Earth rapidly loses its heat through infrared radiation escaping upward into the cold outer atmosphere. By creating a continuous physical barrier of heavy smoke particles hovering directly above the trees, Loretta trapped the radiant heat escaping from the soil, bouncing it back down into the root zone and microclimate beneath the leaves. To reinforce this thermal trap, Loretta walked to her irrigation pump house and engaged her low-volume, overhead microsprinkler line. A steady, fine mist of well water sprayed across the outer leaves and exposed fruit clusters. Passing along the road in his warm truck, the regional machinery salesman spotted the fine mist coating Loretta's orchard and scoffed, believing that spraying water on fruit during a freeze was an act of complete ignorance that would freeze her crop solid. But Loretta understood the hidden thermal laws of water physics. Well water drawn from deep underground held a constant ambient temperature of roughly 54 degrees Fahrenheit. More importantly, as water changes physical states from a liquid to a solid ice shell, it releases a continuous, measurable amount of latent heat, precisely 80 calories of thermal energy per gram of water frozen. As the continuous fine mist settled on the oranges, it began to freeze into a clear, thin coat of ice. The physical process of this ice formation continuously released latent heat directly onto the surface of the fruit skin, keeping the temperature beneath the ice shell hovering precisely at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, safely above the critical internal freezing threshold of the orange juice vesicles. Throughout the long, bitter night, as the temperature outside the smoke blanket dropped to 21 degrees, Loretta walked her orchard rows relentlessly, monitoring her wooden porch thermometers and feeding fresh damp sawdust to the smoldering smoke piles. She carefully adjusted the irrigation valves to ensure that the water flow remained constant, for she knew that if the misting stopped before sunrise, the protective latent heat reaction would cease, causing the ice shell to cool rapidly below freezing and damage the fruit. While neighboring commercial growers relying on noisy, mechanical wind machines suffered unexpected mechanical breakdowns and localized cold pockets that froze their crops, Loretta's grove remained encased in a steady, protective microclimate of insulating smoke and latent heat thermal armor. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the freezing air reached its absolute nadir, yet inside the orchard microclimate, the air remained remarkably still, cushioned by the hovering thermal blanket. Loretta stood under the dark canopy, her lantern casting soft yellow light against the glistening ice-coated oranges that hung like translucent crystal ornaments from the branches. She checked the tissue density of a sample fruit near the perimeter, confirming that while the outer eye shell was solid, the juice inside remained liquid, moving freely within its cellular walls. As the first faint light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky in soft hues of rose and pale gold, the extreme temperature drop began to reverse. The morning sun finally broke over the horizon, its gentle rays penetrating the lingering wisps of white smoke and striking the icy leaves. Loretta turned off the irrigation pump and watched closely as the thin ice coatings began to crack and slide off the glossy leaves, dripping harmlessly into the damp soil beneath. Underneath the melted ice armor, the oranges emerged vibrant, firm, and fully intact, their deep golden color undiminished by the bitter cold that had ravaged the surrounding valley. A comprehensive post-freeze inspection later that morning revealed that Loretta had preserved her entire 40-acre harvest without losing a single fruit or suffering branch loss, achieving complete protection at a fraction of the cost of heavy industrial machinery. The regional machinery rep returned past noon, expecting to see a destroyed crop, but was left speechless as he witnessed Loretta and her local helpers hand-picking barrels of pristine, juicy oranges bound for the premium commercial market. The triumphant defense of Loretta's orange grove demonstrates the enduring value of traditional agricultural wisdom grounded in sound physical principles. Severe unseasonal freezes pose an existential threat to broadleaf fruit production, as internal cellular rupture permanently destroys crop value. While modern mechanized solutions require vast capital investment and carry high operational failure risks during extreme atmospheric events, traditional integrated freeze protection, specifically radiant heat retention through smudge smoke blankets combined with latent heat water application, provides a proven, highly effective, and sustainable defense. By understanding the thermodynamic laws of nature rather than attempting to overpower them with heavy machinery, family farmers continue to safeguard their crops, preserve their land, and secure the independent legacy of their homesteads for generations to come.